In the gritty underworld of crime and vengeance, sometimes it only takes a single mistake to unravel a whole empire. When a group of reckless bikers, lost in their arrogance, destroy the car of a seemingly ordinary nurse, they unknowingly ignite a chain of events that will bring the entire criminal organization to its knees. What they don't know is that the nurse, left shattered and powerless by the attack, has a brother. One who has lived in the shadows for years, a professional killer known for his ruthless efficiency. As the bikers' reckless actions set off a series of tragic and brutal events, their world will crumble, piece by piece. Before we continue with the story, tell us where you're watching from. If you like this story, hit that subscribe button for our YouTube channel and turn on notifications so you never miss our upcoming stories. Your support truly helps us share these hard-hitting stories with more people. It was a Tuesday when it all began. Just an ordinary day for Lily Harris. She had just finished her shift at the local hospital, the sterile scent of antiseptic still clinging to her uniform as she stepped out into the cool night air. The streetlights flickered above her, casting long, haunting shadows as she walked toward her car, parked in a dimly lit section of the lot. Lily always took the late shift, working tirelessly to save lives and tend to the broken. But tonight, her tired mind was focused on one thing: getting home. She approached her aging sedan. The one she had scraped together all her savings to buy after her old car finally gave out. It wasn't much, but it was hers. The battered blue exterior and worn-up upholstery were a testament to her modest lifestyle, but it had always gotten her from point A to point B. Now, as she neared the vehicle, she could already tell something was wrong. Her heart skipped a beat. The rear end of her car was smashed in. The bumper crumpled like paper under the weight of whatever had hit it. The paint on the back fender was scraped off, leaving exposed metal. The damage was extensive. Her knees buckled, and she leaned against the side of the car for support, staring at the mess. "Who the hell would do something like this?" she muttered, her voice thick with disbelief. The parking lot was nearly empty, save for a few scattered cars. No one else was around. She glanced around, hoping to spot a witness, but there was nothing. She reached for her phone, dialing the number of her brother, James. The two of them had always been close. Lily, the caring nurse, and James, the enigmatic older sibling who kept his distance from her world. He was the kind of person who didn't like to talk about his work. She never pressed him on it, but she knew he had a mysterious side. He had a way of disappearing for days without warning, and when he returned, he was always different. James answered on the second ring. "Lily? What's wrong?" Her voice was shaky as she explained what had happened. "My car. It's wrecked. I don't know who did it, but it's bad, James." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Lily could almost hear him processing the situation. James didn't say much, but his tone was calm, almost too calm. "I'll be there in 15 minutes, he said, before hanging up. Lily stood there, alone, her heart racing. She didn't know why, but she could feel a sense of dread settling over her. The crash wasn't just random. It felt deliberate, like someone had meant to destroy her. But who? And why? She couldn't shake the feeling that something far darker was at play here. As she waited, her mind raced with possibilities. She had no enemies, at least, none she could think of. But her thoughts kept returning to her brother. James had always been protective, always there when she needed him. But she had never really understood the full extent of his life. And in this moment, standing in the cold, broken in front of her car, she felt a sense of unease she couldn't shake. Little did Lily know, her world was about to collide with forces she couldn't even imagine. Her brother's world, one filled with danger and darkness, was about to come crashing into hers, and everything she thought she knew would change forever. James Harris was not the kind of man you noticed unless he wanted you to. He had an unassuming presence, blending into the background like a shadow in the dark. But behind his calm exterior lay a mind honed for precision, years of training and experience that made him one of the most feared individuals in the criminal underworld. Lily had always been blind to it. Or maybe she had chosen not to see the truth, knowing the man she called her brother was nothing like the people he dealt with. As James pulled up to the scene in his black SUV, the sound of his engine revving through the empty street sliced through the quiet night like a blade. He parked beside Lily's wrecked car, stepping out with his usual calm, his dark eyes scanning the area with practiced scrutiny. His fingers ran along the smooth surface of the SUV, as if mentally preparing himself for what was coming next. Lily stood frozen, her eyes locked on the destruction of her car. The moonlight cast an eerie glow on the damaged vehicle, making it look almost like a crime scene. She could see James walking toward her, his presence like a storm brewing on the horizon. As he approached, he didn't say a word. He didn't need to. He could tell from her face that the situation was far worse than just an accident. "Who did this?" James asked, his voice cold, yet not unkind. It was the way he always spoke, detached, as though he were observing the situation from a distance. Lily shook her head, her hands trembling slightly as she gestured toward the wreckage. "I don't know. I found it like this. There was no one around, no witnesses. It's like someone just wanted to make a statement." James crouched beside the car, running his fingers lightly over the damage. The sense of calm in his demeanor was unsettling to Lily. He wasn't upset. He wasn't angry. He was just analyzing, calculating. "This wasn't an accident," he muttered. His eyes narrowed as he inspected the scene more closely. "This was personal." Lily swallowed hard. "What do you mean, personal? Who would want to hurt me?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stood up and turned his attention to the surroundings. He knew something she didn't, something that had been left unsaid between them for years. And now, as the tension in the air thickened, he knew that something far more dangerous was unfolding. His thoughts raced, but he kept them hidden, concealed behind his unflinching exterior. The bikers hadn't been careful, and it was that mistake that would cost them everything. As James stepped back, his hand brushed against the cold steel of the car, his mind working swiftly. He'd already started forming a plan, a way to handle whatever was coming next. His connection to the criminal world ran deep, and he knew exactly where to look, who to ask, and most importantly, who to punish. "You don't have to worry about this," he said to Lily, his voice steady and confident. "I'll handle it." But Lily was far from reassured. Something about the way James spoke, so detached, so calm, unnerved her. She had always relied on him, trusted him, but now she felt as though there was a chasm between them, a gulf that had never existed before. She had no idea what James was capable of, and that scared her. The man standing before her now wasn't the brother who had once held her hand through hard times. He was someone else entirely. As James stood by her, observing the wreckage, a faint roar of motorcycle engines broke through the night air. It was distant at first, but growing louder, closer. Lily's heart skipped a beat as she turned toward the sound, her mind racing with the realization that her brother had already put a plan in motion. The bikers were coming back, and they had no idea what they were about to walk into. The engines of the motorcycles grew louder, their rumbling sound reverberating in the empty streets like an impending storm. Lily's heart raced, a mix of confusion and fear gripping her chest. She didn't know who these bikers were, nor why they had chosen to destroy her car. But standing next to James, she could feel an unspoken tension in the air. Her brother was different now. The calm, collected exterior he wore wasn't just a shield. It was his armor. James had already assessed the situation. His dark eyes narrowed as the sound of the motorcycles came closer, his hands moving with a practiced ease, adjusting the sleeves of his jacket as if he were preparing for a fight. There was no panic in his movements, no sign of hesitation. He had been in worse situations before. But Lily? She could feel her pulse racing, her body tense with anxiety as she looked from her brother to the approaching bikers. "What's happening, James?" she asked, her voice tight with fear. She couldn't help herself. The reality of the situation was starting to hit her. "Stay close," he ordered, his tone brokering no argument. "Don't make a sound." Lily's breath caught in her throat. She didn't know what James was planning, but she trusted him. Or at least, she tried to. It was hard to reconcile the man in front of her with the brother she'd always known. The man who had always protected her, but had always kept his secrets hidden behind locked doors. The first of the bikers came into view, a hulking figure in leather, his motorcycle kicking up the dust as he slowed near the wreckage of Lily's car. He was followed by several others, each one dressed in the same intimidating attire, with patches on their jackets that signified their affiliation with a local gang. The insignia on their backs was clear enough: the Black Vultures, a notorious biker gang known for their brutality and lawlessness. Lily instinctively took a step back, her eyes darting between her brother and the approaching bikers. James, however, stood still, his posture unwavering. He didn't even flinch as the leader of the gang dismounted and strode toward them with a swagger that suggested he was used to having power over people. "You're the one who wrecked my car?" Lily heard the biker grunt, his voice rough and cold. His eyes were bloodshot, his face twisted in a permanent scowl. Lily opened her mouth to respond, but James spoke before she could. "No," he said, his voice low, almost menacing. "She's not the one who did this, but I think you'll regret it if you don't explain why your crew destroyed her property." The leader of the bikers stopped dead in his tracks. There was a brief silence as his gaze flickered to James, as if he were trying to size him up. Then, without warning, the biker grinned. It was a malicious, mocking expression, like he was used to intimidating people and getting away with it. "I don't know who you think you are, buddy, but—" the biker began, but James was already moving. Faster than Lily could process, James closed the gap between them with a speed that seemed impossible for a man of his size. Before the biker could finish his sentence, James's hand shot out, gripping the man's throat with an ironclad grip. The biker choked, his eyes widening in shock as he tried to break free, but James's hold was unyielding. There was no fear in James's eyes, only cold determination. "You should have thought about that before you wrecked her car," James said, his voice as sharp as a blade. Lily stood frozen, watching in a mix of horror and disbelief as the bikers around her froze, unsure of what to do next. She had never seen this side of James, never imagined that he could become so fierce. Her mind screamed at her to intervene, to stop him from going too far, but there was something in his gaze that told her she was powerless to change the course of events. With a single, brutal twist, James threw the biker to the ground with a thud that echoed in the quiet night. The man gasped for air, scrambling to his feet as James towered over him, his body language exuding a quiet but overwhelming dominance. "This is your only warning," James said, his voice now a low growl. "Next time, it won't be just the car you lose." The leader of the bikers staggered back, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and confusion. The rest of the gang members looked on, unsure of how to respond. They had expected a confrontation, but not like this. James wasn't just some victim. They could see that now. He was someone dangerous, someone whose very presence was enough to make them question everything they thought they knew about the world. "Do we have a problem?" James asked, his eyes flicking from the leader to the rest of the bikers. There was a sharpness in his gaze that made them hesitate, unsure of what would happen next. The biker leader wiped his mouth, glaring at James with raw hatred. But even he could sense the danger in James's stance, the way he moved with the confidence of someone who had seen it all and had the skills to back it up. After a tense silence, the biker leader nodded, stepping back. "No problem. We'll take care of our own, all right?" he muttered, still seething but unwilling to push further. James didn't acknowledge him. Instead, he turned to Lily, his expression softening ever so slightly. "Get in the car. We're leaving." Lily stood still for a moment, her mind spinning. What had just happened? What kind of man had her brother become? And what did all this mean for her? As the bikers retreated, still nursing their bruises and wounded pride, James led Lily to the car. The night was far from over, but Lily couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The storm James had unleashed was only going to grow, and she wasn't sure whether she was ready for it. But there was no turning back now. The car was silent as James drove, the low hum of the engine the only sound that accompanied the two siblings on their journey. Lily sat beside her brother, her mind reeling from the events that had unfolded just moments earlier. She couldn't help but replay the scene over and over in her head. The brutal efficiency with which James had taken control of the bikers, the way he had made them tremble with nothing more than his presence. It was as if she had seen a side of him she had never known existed, a side that felt both terrifying and oddly familiar. She had always admired him, always looked up to him as the older brother who had been there for her through thick and thin. But now, she realized she had never truly known him, not in the way that mattered. Her thoughts were interrupted as James's voice broke through the tension in the car. "They'll be back," he said, his tone flat, almost clinical. "The bikers. They won't let this go so easily." Lily turned to him, her voice shaking with disbelief. "What are you talking about? You just made them back down. Why would they come after us again?" James's eyes flicked briefly to her before returning to the road ahead. "Because you're not dealing with just a group of thugs. The Black Vultures are part of something much bigger. They're connected to a larger criminal empire, one with a lot of power and resources. And when you hit someone like that, you don't just walk away without consequences." Lily swallowed hard, her throat tight with fear. She had no idea what her brother was talking about. This wasn't just a random attack on her car. It was part of something far more dangerous. "Who are they?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Who are you, James?" James didn't immediately respond. The air in the car grew heavy, thick with unspoken words. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke. His voice low and filled with a kind of quiet intensity that sent chills down Lily's spine. "I'm someone who's been doing things you won't understand. Things I've had to do to protect you, to protect us both. You never asked, Lily, and I never wanted you to know. But this, what's happening now, this is my world. The Black Vultures aren't just bikers. They're part of a larger criminal network, a syndicate of sorts. Drugs, weapons, extortion, all of it. And their reach is far. What you've seen tonight is just the tip of the iceberg." Lily's breath caught in her throat. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat feeling like a hammer against her ribs. Her brother, the man she had trusted, the man who had always been there for her, was a part of something so dark, so dangerous, that it seemed impossible. "I didn't want you to know," James continued, his voice soft but firm. "I didn't want you involved. But now they know about you. And when they find out I'm connected to you, they'll come for you. They'll come for both of us." Lily didn't know what to say. Her mind was spinning, trying to process the revelations that had come crashing into her life. She had always thought of her brother as the protector, the one who kept her safe from the world's horrors. But now, it seemed that the horrors were all around her, and her brother was not just a bystander. He was part of the very thing that threatened her. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why keep me in the dark?" James's jaw tightened as he kept his eyes on the road. "Because I didn't want you to be a part of this world. It's not a place for someone like you." "But now," he paused, his voice trailing off as he glanced toward the rearview mirror, his eyes scanning the road behind them. Lily could see the change in him now, the way his shoulders stiffened, the way his fingers gripped the steering wheel with a white-knuckled intensity. Something was coming, something worse than what had already happened. The air was thick with anticipation, the kind of silence that filled a room just before a storm broke loose. "We need to get out of here," James said suddenly, his voice low and urgent. "They'll be coming after us, and when they do, they won't stop until they get what they want." Lily's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean they won't stop? What do they want?" James's expression darkened, his eyes narrowing as he glanced once more at the rearview mirror. "They'll want retribution. For what I did. For what they think I've taken from them. But this time, it's not just the Black Vultures. We've made a bigger enemy. And they won't just come after us. They'll go after anyone we care about." Lily's chest tightened at his words. "You're talking about them. Your enemies? The ones you've been hiding from all these years?" James's silence was answer enough. She could feel the weight of his past pressing down on them both. The world her brother had kept hidden from her was now crashing into her life, and she was powerless to stop it. Suddenly, a flash of headlights appeared in the rearview mirror, growing closer, faster. Lily's heart skipped a beat. The bikers were back. She could feel the adrenaline surge through her veins, the fight-or-flight instinct kicking in as her mind raced with panic. "Hold on," James said, his voice deadly serious. "We're not going to outrun them. But we're not going down without a fight." He slammed the pedal to the floor. The night exploded with speed. James's SUV roared as it surged forward, its tires screeching against the asphalt. Lily's heart pounded in her chest, each thundering beat echoing in her ears as she clutched the seat, her knuckles white from the grip. The headlights of the bikers' motorcycles gleamed in the rearview mirror, growing closer with terrifying intensity. They weren't just following, they were closing in. "Hold on tight," James shouted, his voice filled with a sense of calm urgency. His hands were steady on the wheel, but his eyes were sharp, constantly scanning the road ahead, calculating their every move. Lily didn't know what to expect next. She had seen James take control before, but this was something different. He wasn't just driving. He was preparing for something far worse. Lily's mind raced. The bikers weren't just angry, they were coming for them, and they weren't going to stop until they had exacted their revenge. The sudden, brutal realization struck her like a punch to the gut. Everything her brother had warned her about was real. The darkness, the danger, the enemies lurking in the shadows. It was all crashing into her life in a way she couldn't outrun. Through the side window, Lily could see the glowing headlights of the motorcycles, getting closer with every passing second. The sound of their engines was deafening now, the revving like a predator closing in on its prey. Her breath came in quick, shallow gasps. What would James do? How would they escape this? Her brother's grip on the steering wheel tightened, and he jerked the wheel hard to the right, making the SUV veer sharply down an alleyway. The sudden change in direction threw Lily against the door, but she barely had time to react before James corrected the vehicle, his foot slamming down on the gas once more. The alleyway was narrow, lined with dumpsters and debris, but James navigated it with precision, his eyes tracking the way ahead even in the low light. Lily glanced back to see the bikers following, undeterred by the change in route. They had split into two groups, one group taking the main road and the other, led by their leader, weaving through the alley after them. "Damn it," James muttered, his jaw clenched tight. "They know this route." Lily's heart sank. The bikers were more organized than she had imagined. This wasn't just a random attack, it was a coordinated pursuit, and they weren't about to let up. Without warning, James slammed on the brakes, sending the SUV skidding to a stop just inches away from a solid brick wall. Lily gasped, her chest tightening as she was thrown forward, only to be held in place by the seatbelt. Before she could process what had happened, James was already in motion again, yanking the wheel hard to the left, and the SUV lurched forward, back onto the road. "Where are we going?" Lily gasped, her voice strained from the rush of adrenaline. She wasn't sure if she was more scared of the bikers or the reckless speed at which her brother was driving. James didn't answer, but his focus was razor-sharp as he sped through the streets, taking sharp turns and darting down side streets with a fluidity that made Lily's head spin. The bikers weren't far behind. One of the motorcycles veered ahead, cutting off their escape. "I told you not to make this personal," James muttered under his breath, his eyes narrowing as the leader of the Black Vultures moved into view. He could see the biker's twisted grin, his taunting gaze locked on James's every move. James swerved sharply to the right, the SUV lurching again as the back tires slid out from under him. He wasn't going to let them trap him, but the bikers were relentless. The leader of the pack, the one James had thrown to the ground earlier, had caught up, and now, he was determined to take revenge. He accelerated, heading straight for the SUV, intent on smashing into it. The roar of the engine was deafening as the motorcycle closed in. Lily's stomach dropped. "James!" Without a word, her brother hit the brakes again, sending the SUV screeching to a halt just as the motorcycle shot past. For a split second, it felt like time froze. The biker had miscalculated, too focused on his target to see the trap coming. As the motorcycle zoomed by, James's hands flicked the gearshift, and the SUV darted forward with a speed that made Lily's stomach lurch. Before the biker could turn around, James had pulled ahead, weaving through traffic and taking a sharp left, cutting off the path the motorcycle had been speeding down. The sudden maneuver threw the biker off balance, and with a screeching sound, he lost control, slamming into the curb before tumbling into a nearby dumpster with a loud crash. "Got one," James said, his voice calm despite the chaos. But there was no time to celebrate. The others were still coming, and they were angrier now than ever. James's foot slammed down on the gas once more, speeding through the city, his focus intense as he dodged cars and streetlights, trying to keep ahead. But no matter how many twists and turns he took, the bikers were always just behind them, pushing harder, faster. Lily's breath was shallow, her mind whirling as the reality of the situation sank deeper into her bones. There was no escape from this, no easy way out. These bikers weren't just random criminals. They were a part of something far bigger than either of them could have anticipated. And now, her brother's past, his hidden life, was pulling her deeper into the very heart of that world. "James, we can't keep running," she shouted over the roar of the engine. James didn't answer, his face a mask of concentration. He knew she was right, but there was no other option right now. If they stopped, if they hesitated, it would all be over. Suddenly, a thought struck him. He wasn't going to run anymore. James's grip on the steering wheel tightened, his knuckles turning white. The steady roar of the bikers' engines was getting closer again. But this time, he wasn't going to keep running. They had pushed him too far. His brotherly instincts, the need to protect Lily, had been the driving force until now. But he could feel something else taking over. Something darker, more ruthless. He had been waiting for this moment, knowing that if he didn't strike back now, things would only escalate further. His eyes flicked to Lily, who was gripping the door handle in a vice-like hold, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. He could see the terror in her expression, but he knew she had no idea what was about to happen. There was no way to prepare her for it, no way to soften the blow. The life she had known, the safety she had once taken for granted, was gone now. And there was only one way to regain control of the situation. "We're going to stop this," James said, his voice low, filled with a cold determination. Lily turned to him, her breath catching in her throat. "James, what do you mean? You can't." "I have to," he interrupted, his voice clipped. "We can't outrun them forever. We'll drive into a trap. But if I'm going to keep you safe, we have to take control. No more running." Before Lily could respond, James jerked the wheel, sending the SUV onto a side road that ran parallel to the main highway. It was darker here, the streetlights fewer and farther apart, but it was the perfect place to set up their counterstrike. He knew exactly what he was doing. This was his world, after all. A world of shadows, manipulation, and calculated risks. Lily felt a chill creep up her spine as she watched her brother work. There was something cold about him now, a kind of detached calmness that was at once terrifying and commanding. The man who had been her protector was slipping away, replaced by someone much darker. She wanted to scream, to demand that he stop this madness, but the words caught in her throat. She knew he wasn't going to listen. He never had. James's eyes scanned the rearview mirror once again. The bikers were still pursuing, their headlights coming up fast, but this time, James wasn't worried. He knew exactly how they'd play it. "Get ready," he muttered under his breath. Lily felt a knot tighten in her stomach as they approached a narrow bridge that spanned a deep ravine. James accelerated as they neared the bridge, the SUV barreling toward it with reckless speed. "What are you doing?" Lily shouted, panic rising in her chest. But James didn't respond. Instead, he pushed the pedal to the floor, sending the SUV rocketing forward. The bikers, still tailing them, saw what was happening just in time. They sped up, trying to cut them off before they reached the bridge, but James had already planned for this. At the last moment, James swerved hard to the right, his tires screeching against the pavement as he drove the SUV directly onto the dirt embankment beside the bridge. The move was so sharp, so sudden, that Lily's stomach lurched. They were no longer driving along the road. Instead, James was forcing the SUV into an off-road path that led them directly into a clearing hidden behind thick trees. Lily glanced back just in time to see the bikers fly past, their faces twisted in anger, unable to stop themselves from barreling toward the bridge. The leader of the gang, his face full of rage, slammed his hand down on his handlebars, but it was too late. The bikers had missed their mark. "Hold on," James muttered, his foot heavy on the accelerator. Before Lily could fully process what was happening, James swung the SUV around, taking them back onto a narrow dirt path that ran parallel to the bikers' route. The bikers were stuck for a moment, trying to make a U-turn on the narrow bridge. They had no idea that James had already planned his next move. James's eyes were sharp now, his mind calculating, picking apart their every move. The bikers were still trying to regroup, unaware that James had already positioned the SUV in the perfect spot to intercept them. It was time to turn the tables. "Ready?" James asked, his voice steady and cold. Lily felt a rush of anxiety. "What are you going to do?" "Make them regret messing with us," he replied, his words laced with a deadly calm. He was done being the victim in this game. Now, he was going to take control. In one smooth motion, James threw the SUV into reverse, speeding back toward the bridge. The headlights of the bikers' motorcycles still glared ahead, and the sound of their engines grew louder with each passing second. But James wasn't retreating. He was setting the stage. When they were close enough, he slammed the SUV into park, grabbed a rifle from the back seat, one that he had kept hidden from her view, and popped the door open. Lily's breath caught in her throat as he moved quickly, pulling the rifle into position. "What are you?" she began. But before she could finish, James was already aiming the weapon toward the bikers. The leader of the gang was the first to spot them, his eyes widening as he tried to steer his motorcycle away from the SUV. But James's hand was steady. In one swift motion, he fired, the sharp crack of the gun splitting the air. The bullet hit the front tire of the leader's bike, causing it to swerve uncontrollably. The biker screamed as he lost control and was sent hurtling into the ravine. The rest of the bikers were in disarray, unsure of how to respond. They had been so sure of their superiority, so sure that they would crush James and Lily without a second thought. But now, they were scattered and confused. James didn't waste time. He fired again, this time hitting the closest bike, sending it careening off the road. The remaining bikers hesitated, realizing that the tables had turned. Lily stared in disbelief, her heart racing as she watched James take them down, one by one. He had become a force they couldn't reckon with. And as the last of the bikers retreated, Lily realized that this moment, this confrontation, was more than just a fight over a car. It was a reckoning, a message to anyone who would dare to come after them. James had just made his statement, and now they would know. No one messed with his family. The silence that followed the chaos was deafening. Lily sat in the passenger seat, her heart still pounding in her chest, her hands shaking. The sounds of the bikers' retreating motorcycles faded into the distance, leaving only the quiet hum of the SUV's engine as it idled in the dark clearing. The night felt thick with tension, like the world itself was holding its breath. James, meanwhile, sat in stillness, his eyes fixed on the rearview mirror, ensuring the threat was completely gone. The rifle was back in the seat, his fingers lightly resting on its barrel as if the motion of firing had been second nature. He wasn't panicking. He wasn't even breathing heavily. It was as though the violence, the destruction, hadn't fazed him at all. Lily, on the other hand, was barely holding herself together. Her breaths were shallow, her mind trying to wrap itself around what had just happened. She had seen the fury in James's eyes, his cold determination. But now, that fury was gone, replaced by an unnerving calm that unsettled her more than anything. She glanced at him, her voice shaky as she asked, "James, what the hell was that?" James didn't immediately answer. His focus was still fixed on the road, scanning the area, checking for any signs that the bikers might regroup or return. The night felt strangely still, but Lily couldn't shake the unease in her gut. Her brother had just taken down a group of men, mercilessly, ruthlessly, and it had felt like he wasn't just protecting her, but sending a message. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, James spoke, his voice calm but with a sharp edge. "That was the last warning, Lily. If they think they can come at us again, they're wrong. They won't get another chance." Lily's eyes widened as she processed his words. "What do you mean, last warning? What is going on, James? Who are these people?" James exhaled slowly, his hands still on the wheel as he finally turned to look at her. There was something cold in his eyes now, a depth of calculation that sent a chill down her spine. He had always been protective, always kept her safe. But now there was something more. He wasn't just a man looking out for his sister anymore. He was a force, someone who had been molded by years of violence and shadow. "You want the truth?" he asked, his voice quiet, but there was no mistaking the weight behind his words. Lily nodded, her throat tight. She had no idea what she had stepped into, but she was already deep into it. There was no turning back now. She had seen it in his eyes earlier. The storm that had been gathering for years, and now it had broken. James leaned back in his seat, his hands relaxed on the wheel now, but his gaze never wavered from the road. The Black Vultures are part of something much bigger. They're connected to a larger network, drugs, weapons, all kinds of illicit businesses. I've been working with them for years, but I've always kept you away from it. I thought I could protect you from the mess I've made, but now, he paused, his expression hardening, now, they've found you. They found us. Lily's stomach churned. You've been working with them? You've been involved in all of that? All this time? James didn't flinch. I've been trying to get out. I've been trying to keep it all away from you. But these people, he shook his head, his voice low and filled with a quiet rage. They don't let go. They won't stop until they have everything they want. Lily's mind reeled as she processed his words. Her brother, the man she had trusted more than anyone, was deep into a criminal underworld she hadn't even known existed. And now, because of one act of reckless destruction, it had all come crashing into her life. She had been a pawn in a much larger game, and she hadn't even realized it. Why didn't you tell me? Why keep me in the dark? She asked, her voice breaking as the weight of the betrayal settled on her chest. Why didn't you warn me? James's eyes flicked to hers, the expression on his face unreadable. Because I thought I could protect you. I thought I could keep you safe from all of this. But now, he paused, his voice taking on a quieter, more ominous tone. Now, I can't protect you anymore. This is bigger than you or me, and they'll come for us. They won't stop until they've broken everything we've built. The words hung in the air, heavy and oppressive. Lily didn't know how to respond. There were no answers, no comforting words. She had never imagined this was the world her brother had been living in, the world he had been trying to shield her from. But now, it was too late. She was already in too deep. We need to get out of here, James said suddenly, breaking the silence. It's only a matter of time before they send more. We need to move. Now. Lily nodded, her mind still racing as she tried to piece everything together. She wasn't sure if she was ready for what came next, but one thing was certain. Her life had just become a lot more dangerous. James put the SUV in gear, and they drove into the night, the weight of what had just transpired pressing down on both of them. Lily's thoughts were a whirlwind. Her brother's hidden life, the bikers, the criminal empire, and somewhere, deep in the pit of her stomach, she knew the worst was yet to come. The drive was endless. The world outside the SUV blurred by the headlights and the flickering streetlights, as the vehicle sped down winding roads, through shadowed streets, and into the unfamiliar parts of the city. Lily's eyes were fixed on the passing darkness, but her mind was far away, replaying everything James had said. The weight of the truth was suffocating her, and the realization that her life was no longer her own was almost too much to bear. She kept glancing at James as he drove, his expression focused but unreadable. He didn't seem rattled by what had just happened, by the violence, the brutality of it all. He had been a force to be reckoned with, but now, there was something cold about him, something distant. It was like she was sitting next to a stranger, not the brother she had grown up with. The words he had said echoed in her mind. They'll come for us. They won't stop until they've broken everything we've built. She didn't know if she was ready for what that meant, but it was clear. James's world, his past, was now her present, and she was in it, whether she liked it or not. She had seen too much, and now there was no turning back. Where are we going? Lily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. James's eyes flicked to her, his jaw tightening slightly. We need to get off the grid for a while. The bikers will report back. Soon, we'll have more than just them on our tail. We need to lay low. Lily nodded, but her mind was racing. Lay low? Was that all they could do now? Hide. The thought terrified her, but she said nothing. What was the point of asking questions? She had no idea what kind of trouble they were in. It was clear now that they were in deep, and everything James had been running from was about to catch up to them. As they continued to drive, Lily's thoughts drifted back to the moment when the bikers had charged after them, when James had turned the tables and sent them scattering. The way he had fired that gun, the calm precision with which he had handled everything, had been so effortless. It was like he had been preparing for this moment his entire life. Her brother wasn't just a former soldier or someone with dangerous connections. He was someone who had been living on the edge for years. But now, she had a front-row seat to the storm that was coming for them. "James, I don't," Lily began, but her voice faltered as she tried to find the right words. "I don't know if I can keep doing this. I don't know if I can just—" Her words were cut off as James slammed on the brakes, throwing her forward against the seatbelt. The SUV screeched to a halt, the tires locking as the car shuddered. Lily's breath caught in her throat. "What's happening?" she asked, her voice shaking. James's gaze was steely as he looked into the rearview mirror. "They found us." His voice was quiet, but filled with a deadly calm. Before Lily could fully comprehend the words, she heard the unmistakable roar of motorcycle engines behind them. Her pulse quickened. There were more of them. She hadn't imagined it. There was no way they could hide for long. The bikers had called in reinforcements, and now they were closing in fast. "What do we do?" Lily whispered, panic creeping into her voice. James didn't hesitate. "We fight." With that, he yanked the wheel to the right, taking the SUV off the road and into an abandoned industrial area. The buildings were dark, their windows boarded up, but they provided the cover they needed. James was maneuvering quickly, his eyes darting around as if he were anticipating every move, every turn the bikers might take. Lily could hear the motorcycles behind them, the engines loud and relentless, getting closer by the second. She could feel the tension in her chest, the weight of the impending confrontation hanging like a storm cloud above them. Her brother wasn't backing down, and she knew he wasn't planning to let anyone hurt her, but she wasn't sure what they were about to face, or if they'd survive it. "Get ready," James said suddenly, pulling the SUV into a narrow alley between two buildings. "Stay low. They won't expect us to fight back." Lily's breath hitched. "James, what do you mean? Are we going to—" "We're not running anymore," he cut in, his voice firm. He parked the SUV behind a stack of crates, the headlights of the approaching motorcycles growing brighter in the rearview mirror. "I'm done running." James reached over to the back seat, grabbing the weapons he'd packed away, 2 handguns and a knife. His movements were fluid, practiced. He handed one of the guns to Lily, who recoiled at first, not understanding what he was asking her to do. But when she saw the steely determination in his eyes, she realized there was no other choice. "I need you to stay sharp," he said. "When they come, don't hesitate. Don't freeze. We're not just protecting the car anymore. We're protecting our lives." Lily's fingers trembled as she took the gun, the weight of it unfamiliar and terrifying in her hands. But she understood. She had seen the dark side of the world her brother was a part of. She had witnessed the brutality that lurked in the shadows. And now, it was their turn to face it. The motorcycles were closer now, their engines growling like beasts, and Lily could see the silhouettes of the bikers in the distance, their headlights cutting through the dark like eyes searching for prey. James didn't wait any longer. He stepped out of the SUV with a fluid grace, his body poised and ready. He didn't seem scared. In fact, there was a certain calm in him now, as if this was just another mission, another job he had to finish. Lily's heart was racing, her hands sweaty against the gun. She didn't want to be here, didn't want to be a part of this world. But as the bikers came into full view, the leader at the front with a devilish grin on his face, Lily knew that there was no escaping it. There was no going back. "James," she whispered, her voice tight, "what happens if we don't make it out of here?" James's gaze was unwavering, his voice low and steady. "We will make it out. Together." The first biker roared forward, and the fight began. The world seemed to slow down, the roar of the approaching motorcycles vibrating through Lily's bones as she stepped out of the SUV. She was gripped by an unfamiliar coldness, a heaviness in her chest that was far worse than the fear she had felt moments ago. But there was no turning back now. Her brother, James, had already set the stage, and she could hear his steady breath beside her as he crouched low, positioning himself to ambush the bikers. The first motorcycle burst into the clearing, its headlights blinding for a moment before the rider veered sharply to one side, taking his position behind a stack of old wooden crates. The leader was close behind, his grin wide and dangerous, clearly relishing the hunt. His crew followed, positioning themselves just beyond the light of the SUV, as though they were predators waiting for the right moment to strike. Lily's pulse raced, her fingers tightening around the gun she had been handed. It felt heavier now, the weight more than just the physical burden. It represented the gravity of the moment, the terrifying realization that she wasn't just a witness anymore. She was part of this war. The thought made her stomach churn, but she pushed it down, focusing on the task at hand. Beside her, James didn't flinch. His eyes were locked on the leader of the bikers, his body coiled like a spring ready to explode. The tension in the air was thick, and every second that passed felt like a countdown to something inevitable. "Stay low," James murmured. His voice was quiet, calm, a stark contrast to the chaos that was unfolding around them. The first biker advanced slowly, creeping closer to their position. He was cautious, clearly expecting some kind of trap. But James had already anticipated this. With a swift motion, he ducked low, silently signaling to Lily to follow. They moved quickly, positioning themselves behind the crates as the sound of the motorcycles grew louder, closer. Lily's heart thundered in her chest as she crouched beside James, her back pressed against the cool metal of the SUV. The night was now alive with sound. The whir of the engines, the rustle of the wind through the empty space, and the heavy, rhythmic pounding of her own breath. Her eyes darted between the bikers, trying to gauge their next move, trying to figure out how to survive this. Her brother had been right. There was no running anymore. The bikers were here, and they wouldn't stop until they had dealt with James, and by extension her. The thought of it made her stomach turn, but there was no time for hesitation. James had already made up his mind. Suddenly, the first biker shot forward, his engine roaring as he charged toward their position. He wasn't expecting the trap, and that's exactly what James had counted on. In one fluid motion, James popped up from behind the crates, his gun raised. The biker never had a chance. The first shot rang out, sharp and clear in the night, hitting the biker square in the chest. The man's body jerked violently, the motorcycle skidding off the road as he slammed into a pile of metal debris with a deafening crash. Lily barely had time to process the violence of it before another biker emerged, this one far quicker, more agile. He swerved to the side, trying to dodge the gunfire, but James was already moving again. His eyes never left his target. A second shot rang out, this time grazing the biker's arm. The man cursed, wincing as he slowed, but he didn't stop. Instead, he turned, trying to get a better shot at James. Lily's instincts kicked in before her mind could even register what was happening. She raised her gun, her hands shaking but steady enough to aim. She hadn't been trained for this. She hadn't been trained for anything like this, but she knew one thing. If she didn't act now, if she didn't help, they were both dead. The biker was close, and Lily had a split second to act. Without thinking, she pulled the trigger. The gunshot rang out, louder than the others, echoing in the narrow alley. The biker stumbled, his hand clutching his side as he swerved out of control. But he didn't go down. A second shot from James sent the biker careening off the road, crashing into the debris with a sickening thud. Lily's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, she felt the weight of what she had just done. She had taken a life. She had taken someone's life. The reality of it hit her like a wave, and she felt the sick churn in her stomach. But there was no time to mourn. Another biker appeared, this one more dangerous than the others, charging forward with unrelenting speed. He was too close now, too fast, and James's gun was empty. Lily didn't even think. She just reacted. She grabbed the second handgun James had placed beside her, her fingers barely able to find the grip. She didn't hesitate this time. The moment the biker came within range, she fired. The shot was wild, too wild, and missed by inches. The biker grinned, knowing he had the upper hand. But James was already moving, positioning himself behind a stack of rusted barrels, his next move calculated and swift. He fired once, twice, and the sound of his shots rang out, precise and brutal. The biker's grin vanished as the first bullet struck him in the shoulder, and the second caught him in the neck. He spun off his bike, his body crumpling to the ground with a sickening thud. For a moment, the silence was deafening. The fight had stopped, the sounds of the engines fading into the distance. The area around them was eerily still, and Lily's breath came in shallow gasps as she tried to steady herself. James stood there, his eyes scanning the perimeter, his hand still gripping his gun as he processed the aftermath. He didn't look at her at first, but when he did, his expression was unreadable. "We're not done yet," he said, his voice low. "There's more. Stay sharp." Lily swallowed hard, her hands still shaking, but she nodded. Her mind was still reeling, the weight of the violence still sinking in, but there was no time to reflect. The battle wasn't over. Not yet. The bikers had underestimated them, but the real storm was still coming, and Lily knew, with a sinking feeling in her gut, that the worst was yet to come. The seconds felt like hours as James and Lily stood in the tense silence. The wreckage of the bikers scattered around them like fallen soldiers. The smell of burned rubber and gunpowder hung thick in the air, mixing with the distant hum of the city far behind them. The dim glow of the streetlights barely illuminated the space around them, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally, as though the darkness itself were closing in on them. Lily's hands were trembling, her mind still processing the chaos that had unfolded before her. She had just killed a man, a biker who had been part of a dangerous gang, and while her body was still in fight-or-flight mode, a coldness had settled in her gut. The reality of what had just happened was too much to grasp all at once. She had been thrust into a world of violence and bloodshed, one she had never wanted to be a part of. She looked at James, his face unreadable, his eyes scanning the area, his hand still gripping his gun with quiet precision. It was like he was in a different world now, his focus unshakable, his demeanor detached from the chaos that surrounded them. This wasn't the brother she knew. This was a man hardened by years of ruthless survival, a man who had been forced to make impossible choices. Her heart tightened as she looked at him. She knew he wasn't just protecting her from the bikers. He was protecting her from himself, from the darkness that had defined his life. And that darkness was now pressing in on them both. "They'll be back," James said suddenly, his voice low, steady, and almost detached. He wasn't speaking to her. He was speaking to himself, making calculations in his mind. His eyes remained focused on the empty space ahead, the slight tension in his jaw telling Lily everything she needed to know. And when they do, they'll come harder. They'll have backup, reinforcements. They'll send everything they have at us. Lily's heart skipped a beat. "What do we do?" James's eyes shifted to her, his gaze cold but not unkind. It was the kind of look she had never seen before, and it scared her more than anything. He wasn't looking at her like a sister anymore. He was assessing her like a partner, someone who would have to fight alongside him to survive. "We don't run," James replied, his voice so calm it was almost unsettling. "If we run, we lose. We take the fight to them. We go to their headquarters, where it all started. If we take them down there, we end it for good. But if we stay here, they'll keep coming. They'll keep finding us, hunting us. And they won't stop until we're dead." Lily stared at him, her breath caught in her throat. She didn't know how to process what he was saying. Go to their headquarters? What did he mean by that? How could they even stand a chance against them? But then it hit her, the thought that had been lingering in the back of her mind since the first biker came charging toward them. James wasn't just talking about surviving. He wasn't talking about getting away. He was talking about ending this, ending the criminal empire that had pulled her brother into its orbit, and that meant going after the heart of the beast. "You're serious," Lily said, her voice thick with disbelief. "You want to go to them? Now?" James gave a sharp nod. "If we don't, we'll be sitting ducks. They're organized. We've taken out a few of their men, but they'll regroup. And when they do, they'll come for us with everything they've got. I'm not about to let them take control again. Not when we have the upper hand." Lily's mind was spinning. The chaos, the gunfire, the violence. It was all too much to absorb. She had always lived her life on the fringes of this world. But now she was in the middle of it, and there was no way out. She could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on her. "I don't know if I can do this," Lily whispered, her voice cracking under the strain. She didn't want to be this person. She didn't want to be a part of this world. But she knew deep down that there was no other choice. Her brother was ready to fight, ready to end it all, and she knew she had to stand by him. James didn't respond immediately. His eyes softened just for a moment before he spoke, his voice quiet, as if he were trying to reassure her, though she could see the storm brewing behind his eyes. You don't have to be like them, Lily. You don't have to become one of them, but you have to survive. And if we're going to survive, we have to finish this. The black vultures won't stop coming until they own us, until they take everything from us. But we're not going to let that happen. Lily didn't know what to say. Her mind was still a whirlwind of conflicting emotions, but when she looked into her brother's eyes, she saw a truth she couldn't deny. James wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. He was fighting to end the cycle that had taken him down this dark path. And if she wanted to protect him, to protect herself, she would have to fight too. With a deep breath, she nodded. Okay, she said, her voice steady now. Let's end it. James's eyes flickered with something. Gratitude, maybe, or perhaps recognition of the fact that his sister had just crossed a line. There was no going back from this, but there was also something else in his gaze, a spark of pride. He didn't want to drag her into his world, but now she was a part of it. Without another word, James turned back toward the wreckage of the bikers, gathering what they could use. Weapons, ammunition, anything that could help them survive the fight that was coming. Lily followed, her fingers trembling as she reached for her own gun, steeling herself for what was to come. The night was quiet again, but only for a moment. The calm before the storm. The moment the words left Lily's mouth, the finality of the decision hit her like a freight train. There was no turning back. They were committed now, both to the fight and to each other. In that moment, Lily realized that everything she thought she knew about herself, about her brother, and about the life she had been living was shattered. There was no more hiding from the darkness, no more pretending that this wasn't real. James worked quickly, his movements precise as he gathered up what they could use from the wreckage of the bikers. He didn't speak much, his focus entirely on the task at hand. Lily, still trying to steady her breath and her thoughts, followed his lead. She had no choice but to trust him, even if she wasn't sure she could fully trust herself anymore. She reached into the pile of discarded gear, picking up another set of ammunition. The weight of the weapons felt heavy in her hands, a constant reminder of the violence that was about to unfold. She could hear the distant hum of engines, the occasional creak of metal as the remaining bikers regrouped. They were coming. James stepped back from the wreckage, his eyes scanning the road ahead. "We need to move now," he said, his voice low, purposeful. "They're going to be back in full force any minute." Lily nodded, her heart racing as she adjusted the gun in her hand. The weight of it was familiar now, almost comforting, though it still felt unnatural. She wasn't sure she was ready for what was to come. But James wasn't waiting for her to catch up. He was already in motion, walking with a calm confidence toward the exit of the industrial area, his footsteps sure and steady. Lily followed him, the adrenaline beginning to kick in as the reality of their situation settled in. This was no longer about survival. This was about ending it. About taking down the empire that had held her brother hostage for so long, and potentially ending her own nightmare in the process. As they reached the edge of the industrial zone, the headlights of the bikers appeared again, their growls echoing in the distance. James motioned for Lily to stay behind him as he pressed up against the side of a dilapidated building. He could see them now, at least a dozen of them, all with the same insignia on their jackets, all glaring toward the place where the two of them were hiding. Lily's heart skipped a beat as she crouched low beside him, trying to steady her breath. They had only a few moments before the bikers would be on them. They had to act quickly. "We can't wait for them to find us," James whispered. "We'll make them come to us. Get ready." Lily felt a cold, hard determination settle in her chest. She had to do this. She had no choice. The man who had always protected her, the man she thought she knew, had been a part of something darker for years. And now, they were going to take it down. But there was a twist. There was no way they were walking away without consequences. There was no clean escape. As the first biker rode into view, James quickly motioned for Lily to follow his lead. They moved with calculated precision, emerging from their hiding place just as the lead biker reached the clearing. Without hesitation, James fired. The gunshot rang out, sharp and brutal in the still night, and the first biker fell, crashing to the ground with a scream. His bike slid out of control, skidding across the cracked pavement, but the chaos didn't stop. Lily's body reacted before her mind could register what was happening. She aimed her weapon at the second biker, her breath shallow and her hands unsteady. Her shot wasn't perfect, but it was enough. The biker reeled back as the bullet grazed his side, sending him careening into a pile of old crates. He hit the ground with a loud thud, his bike crashing to a halt next to him. The remaining bikers were far from deterred. They roared forward, their motorcycles growling louder as they charged toward them, their engines thundering in the silence of the night. James moved swiftly, adjusting his position to get a better angle. Lily's heart raced as the next biker came into view, his eyes wide with fury and desperation. "Move!" James barked, and in one fluid motion, he grabbed Lily by the arm, yanking her behind a dumpster just as the next bullet flew past them. Lily's heart was in her throat as she tried to steady herself, trying to remember everything her brother had taught her about survival. She could hear the shots ringing out now, the chaos enveloping them as the bikers closed in, relentless in their pursuit. The battle had shifted. They weren't just fighting for their lives anymore. They were fighting for control. James fired again, his aim deadly, as another biker fell to the ground. But the leader of the Black Vultures was already closing in on them, his eyes wild with rage. He wasn't about to let this go. "James!" Lily shouted as the leader's bike tore through the alley, heading straight for them. She barely had time to react before the motorcycle was right in front of them. The leader's face twisted in a manic grin, but James was faster. In one swift motion, he lunged forward, aiming his gun at the leader's chest. The shot was precise, clear and deadly. The leader's grin faltered, his body jerking as the bullet struck. His bike swerved out of control, crashing into a pile of metal and debris before he fell to the ground with a sickening crunch. The remaining bikers skidded to a halt, their faces full of disbelief as their leader lay unmoving on the pavement. James stood over the fallen man, his chest rising and falling with each breath. His eyes were cold, calculating, but there was something else there too, something darker. He wasn't just protecting Lily anymore. He wasn't just fighting for survival. He was erasing his past, cutting away the parts of himself that had led him down this path. "We're not done yet," James said, his voice low, almost menacing. "There's more of them." Lily didn't respond. She couldn't. Her body was still shaking from the adrenaline, from the reality of what they had just done. But there was no time for fear now. There was no time for hesitation. They had a war to finish. The night air was thick with tension, the aftermath of their first clash hanging over them like a suffocating fog. The sound of the bikers retreating, the grinding whine of their engines echoing in the distance, had slowly faded into the background. For a moment, there was silence, unnatural, pregnant with the weight of the battle they just fought. Lily's hands were still trembling, the gun she'd been holding now feeling like an alien object in her grip. She had killed. She had taken lives. And though her brother's calm demeanor had been her anchor throughout the chaos, now, standing in the aftermath, the gravity of what they had done crashed into her. There was no escaping it now. She wasn't just a nurse anymore. She wasn't just a sister. She was part of a violent, dangerous world. A world that had swallowed her brother whole and now was dragging her in, whether she was ready or not. James stood in front of her, his back straight, his eyes scanning the area like a hawk. The cold, calculated part of him had emerged in full force, and it was both terrifying and reassuring to see how in control he was. He could sense the shift in Lily, though. He could see the hesitation in her stance, the way her fingers still twitched with the shock of the violence. He knew she wasn't ready. She wasn't built for this life. She wasn't supposed to be a killer. But the world wasn't waiting for her to catch up. The storm was here, and it wouldn't stop until everything they had was reduced to ashes. "We need to move," James said, his voice firm, but not unkind. It wasn't an order. It was a necessity. They had to keep going. Lily nodded, her throat tight, her breath still shallow. She couldn't say anything. What was there to say? The silence between them now was a space filled with unspoken truths. She had always looked up to her brother, admired his strength, his ability to keep calm in the worst of situations. But now, standing here, feeling the weight of everything he had shielded her from, she wasn't sure who the man in front of her really was. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. James didn't hesitate. "We're going to the Black Vulture's headquarters. We're ending this tonight." Lily's stomach turned. They had already killed their way through the night, but this was different. The headquarters wasn't just a safe house. It was the heart of the operation, the nerve center where everything began. Taking it down wasn't just about revenge. It was about destroying the empire James had been a part of for so long. "I can't do this," Lily said, her voice shaky but firm. It wasn't just fear now. It was a voice trying to reclaim what little control she had left. "I can't go in there and—" "You don't have to," James interrupted, turning to her. There was a softness in his gaze now, a flicker of something real, something human. "But I'm going. And you're coming with me." Lily opened her mouth to argue, to say she couldn't handle it, but the look in James's eyes silenced her. She knew. She understood. There was no going back. If she left now, she wouldn't just lose her brother. She would lose herself, her place in his world. And in the end, she knew that the storm wasn't going to just pass by. It would follow them, no matter where they ran. So, with a deep breath, she nodded. She didn't have to like it, but she would follow. She would fight. "We have to move quickly," James said, pulling out his phone. His fingers tapped across the screen, sending out a quick message. "They'll be waiting for us. And when they realize their leaders are down, they'll come for us. But we'll be ready." The words were final, the decision made. There was no hesitation in James now. He was on a mission, and Lily was his only ally in this war. He had already fought for his survival, for her survival, but now, they would both face the consequences of the empire James had been a part of. Lily couldn't quite process it all. The adrenaline was still coursing through her veins, but she could feel her body shutting down. She had to be alert. She had to stay sharp. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about ending the cycle of violence that had consumed her brother's life. They moved through the darkness, heading toward the Black Vulture's headquarters, each step heavy with the knowledge of what was to come. The city was quiet now, too quiet. The streets felt deserted, like the calm before a storm, but the feeling in the air was far from peaceful. Every shadow seemed to conceal an enemy. Every corner could bring another ambush. The headquarters was on the outskirts of the city, a sprawling, fortified compound that had once been the epicenter of the Black Vulture's operations. It was a fortress of crime, with guards posted at every entrance, cameras watching every move. James had been inside countless times, but tonight, it would be different. He wasn't just a visitor anymore. He was the reckoning. As they approached, James slowed, signaling for Lily to stay close. They were close now, too close. Every step felt like it might be their last. The weight of the weapons they carried was almost unbearable, but they were their only chance. They reached the outer gate, and James glanced at Lily, his eyes sharp. "Stay behind me," he said. It wasn't a request. It was an order, and Lily knew that there was no room for doubt. James crouched low, his movements precise and quiet as he reached for the gate. He had already planned their entry, already mapped out the path they would take. He wasn't taking chances. They couldn't afford to. The metal gate creaked open with a low, ominous sound. Inside, the lights of the compound flickered, casting long shadows over the large, empty courtyard. There was no sign of life, but James knew better. They were waiting. A sudden rustle in the shadows sent a chill down Lily's spine, but James was already moving. His gun was raised, his body poised for action. The storm was about to break. The stillness inside the compound was unsettling, a quiet that seemed almost too perfect, too orchestrated. The dim, flickering lights cast an eerie glow over the courtyard, throwing long, distorted shadows across the abandoned vehicles and crates scattered around. It felt like a trap, but James wasn't fooled. He had been in too many situations like this to let the silence deceive him. He crouched low beside a stack of metal barrels, his gun at the ready, his eyes darting back and forth, scanning for any movement. Lily followed his lead, her breath shallow as she kept close to him, trying to steady her hands, still trembling from the events of the night. Every step they took seemed to echo, the crunch of gravel beneath their boots amplifying in the silence. Lily felt the weight of the night pressing on her shoulders. There was no going back. This was the endgame. She could feel the danger hanging in the air, thick and suffocating. And she knew that every move they made would decide whether they lived or died. James peered around the edge of the barrels, his eyes locking on the security station just ahead. The guards would be stationed there, watching the entrances, keeping an eye on anyone who tried to breach the compound. It was a well-oiled machine, a fortress built to keep outsiders out and those within in line. But James knew the layout. He knew the weak points, the blind spots, and they were going to exploit them. "They're expecting us," James whispered, his voice calm, but his eyes fierce. "We need to move fast." Lily swallowed hard, her throat dry. Her mind was still racing, trying to catch up with everything. Exploit the weak points? She hadn't even known there were any. But James was a professional, and she trusted him, more now than ever. Still, her heart was pounding in her chest, and the fear she had pushed away for so long was beginning to surface. She stayed close, keeping her breathing quiet, trying to make herself invisible in the dark. Every sound, every movement felt amplified. She was acutely aware of her presence, the weight of the weapon in her hands, the responsibility of this moment. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting to end a reign of terror that had controlled their lives for far too long. James motioned for her to stay behind him as they neared the security station. He was moving with deadly grace, every step calculated, every breath controlled. He wasn't going to let them take him down without a fight. As they reached the corner of the building, James paused, his hand raised to signal for Lily to stop. He looked back, his eyes locking with hers. There was no fear in his gaze, only determination. It was as though he had already accepted the outcome of this night. If they died here, it wouldn't be without a fight. "We take the guards out quickly," he said in a low voice. "Keep your head down." No hesitation. Lily nodded, her mouth dry as she took a steadying breath. She wasn't sure she could do this. She wasn't sure she was ready to take another life. But as her eyes met James's, she understood. She was already in this. She had already crossed the line. There was no turning back. James gave the signal, and without a moment's hesitation, they moved in. They crept forward, staying in the shadows, just out of sight of the security station. James made the first move, slipping silently behind the closest guard, his hand going to the man's throat. The guard didn't have a chance to react before James's blade was pressed against his neck, silencing him with a quick, efficient strike. Lily's heart pounded as she followed, her hands shaking, but her aim steady. The next guard turned at the sound of the movement, but it was too late. Lily fired, the shot ringing out in the night. The guard collapsed, his body hitting the ground with a heavy thud. They were in. James didn't pause. He moved toward the security station, swiftly and quietly, checking the corners, clearing the area as they went. He wasn't just here to kill. They needed information. The whole structure, the whole network, was going to come crashing down, but only if they got the intel they needed. Lily stayed close, her mind swirling with the noise of her thoughts. But she couldn't afford to freeze. She had to keep moving, keep fighting, just as James had been telling her. She couldn't stop. Not now. The security station was just ahead, and as they approached, James signaled for Lily to stay back. He stepped forward, his movements fluid and silent as he reached the door and quietly eased it open. Inside, a couple of guards were still stationed, oblivious to their presence. James's eyes flicked to the guards, and without hesitation, he fired, the shots silent and precise. One guard dropped to the ground, the other falling moments later. James quickly moved inside, heading straight for the computer terminal. He didn't waste time. Lily kept watch, her hand gripping the gun tightly as she scanned the courtyard. They couldn't afford to let their guard down, not even for a second. She could hear the distant rumble of more bikes, the unmistakable sound of reinforcements. The bikers weren't done yet. They were coming. "Almost there," James muttered, his fingers flying across the keyboard as he accessed the system. "I'll get us what we need." and then we moved to the central office. Lily's gaze flicked nervously toward the horizon. She could feel the storm gathering. The bikers were getting closer. They didn't have much time. The screen in front of James flashed as he cracked the security codes, pulling up the information they needed. It was more than just a list of names. It was the heart of the operation. The Black Vultures Network, their supply lines, their money laundering schemes, their leaders. "This is it," James said, his voice colder than before. He turned to Lily, his eyes now burning with the determination of a man who had nothing left to lose. "Time to end this." Just as he finished speaking, the unmistakable roar of motorcycles reached a deafening crescendo. They were coming. Fast. Lily's breath hitched in her chest as she grabbed her gun again. This was it. This was the moment where everything either fell apart or came together. The storm was here. The sound of the approaching motorcycles echoed through the compound, growing louder with each passing second. The bikers were closing in, their engines reverberating off the metal structures and concrete walls, like a pack of predators hunting down their prey. James didn't flinch. His focus was razor-sharp as he pulled the final data from the computer, his fingers flying across the keyboard, ignoring the chaos outside. Lily, however, could feel her pulse hammering in her ears, the fear rising again like an unstoppable tide. She kept her back pressed to the wall, her gun steady in her hands, her breath shallow as she scanned the courtyard for movement. She could hear the distant roar of the bikes, and she just knew, that they were moments away from an all-out assault. "We're almost done here," James muttered, his eyes flicking from the screen to the door, his body tense. He wasn't worried, at least, he didn't show it. But Lily could feel the tension in the air. They had no more time. The storm was coming, and they would have to face it head-on. Lily swallowed hard. "How much longer?" "Just a few more seconds," James replied, his voice clipped. His eyes locked on the screen, his fingers still typing quickly. He wasn't just extracting information now. He was making sure the compound's entire network was exposed. Once it was out there, there would be no going back. This was the endgame, and if they failed, Lily didn't want to think about failure. She couldn't afford to. She took a deep breath, steadying herself as she glanced over her shoulder. The sound of the motorcycles was almost deafening now. It was impossible to miss, their roar cutting through the night, like a warning, like a declaration. They were almost on top of them. "Done," James said suddenly, snapping Lily's attention back to him. "We have everything. Let's move." Before she could react, James was already on the move, his body fluid as he darted toward the door of the security station, peering out into the courtyard to check for movement. The noise of the bikes was deafening now, and Lily could see the flash of headlights cutting through the dark as the first of the bikers came into view, their eyes locked on the building. "They're here," Lily said, her voice tight, fear still clawing at her chest. James turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Keep your head down. We make a stand here. They won't get through." Lily's hands shook, but she nodded. She could do this. She had to. The time for doubt was over. They had made it this far, and now it was time to finish it. The first wave of bikers came charging into the courtyard, their headlights blinding and their engines roaring. They were close, their motorcycles tearing through the dust and gravel as they approached the building. Lily could see them now, their faces twisted in fury as they realized the compound had been breached. James didn't wait for them to get any closer. He fired first, his shots swift and precise, taking down the first two bikers with deadly accuracy. The sound of gunfire cracked through the air, loud and sharp, echoing in the compound. Lily's heart raced, and before she could process what was happening, she was firing too. Her shots wild but on target, catching one of the bikers in the shoulder. The first biker fell, but there were more, too many more. They kept coming, their bikes skidding to a halt as they dismounted, pulling out their weapons and charging toward the security station. "Move," James barked. He was already on the move, firing at the advancing bikers, but there was no time to waste. The compound was crawling with enemies, and every moment they hesitated put them closer to being overrun. Lily followed, her steps hesitant but determined as she took cover behind a stack of crates. She was out of her depth, she knew that. But right now, There was no room for hesitation. She fired again, this time catching another biker in the chest, sending him sprawling to the ground. But there was no time to celebrate. More were coming. James fired again, his movements fluid, his focus deadly. The bikers were relentless, but James was too fast, too skilled. He was cutting them down one by one, his shots as precise as a surgeon's scalpel, but even he couldn't keep up forever. "We have to go," James said suddenly, his voice cold and commanding. He didn't wait for Lily's response before he was already pulling her forward, leading her away from the security station. Lily barely had time to catch her breath before they were moving again, darting through the compound toward the central office, where the heart of the operation lay. The bikers were hot on their heels, and she could hear the sound of their footsteps, the harsh breaths, the desperate snarls as they closed in. They reached the entrance to the central office, and James signaled for Lily to stay back. He didn't waste time as he kicked open the door, charging inside, the gun raised, ready for anything. Inside, the room was dimly lit, but Lily could make out the shapes of several figures in the shadows, their eyes narrowing as they saw James enter. These weren't just bikers, they were the leaders of the Black Vultures, the ones who had been pulling the strings from the shadows. James didn't hesitate. He fired first, taking down the closest leader with one shot. The others scrambled for cover, but they were no match for James's skill. Lily didn't wait for them to regroup. She fired again, this time taking down one of the men who had tried to duck behind a desk. The room erupted into chaos. Bullets flew, the air thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder. But James and Lily were in the center of it now, the battle unfolding around them, each shot, each movement drawing them closer to the end. And then, just like that, it was over. The last of the leaders fell, his body hitting the ground with a final, sickening thud. The room fell silent, the only sound the heavy breathing of James and Lily as they surveyed the carnage. Lily's heart was pounding in her chest, her hands shaking as she lowered her gun. She didn't know what she felt, relief, fear, exhaustion, or something else entirely. The battle was over, but it felt like they had just begun. James turned to her, his face a mask of exhaustion, but there was something else there too, a glimmer of something soft, something human. "We're done," he said, his voice quiet. "It's over." Lily nodded, her throat tight. But the storm wasn't over for them. The Black Vultures may have been defeated, but the price of survival had been steep. And as they walked out of the compound, into the uncertain darkness beyond, Lily knew they would never be the same again. But for the first time in a long time, she felt something she hadn't felt in what seemed like forever: hope. If you enjoyed this story, please leave your comment below and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel where your support means the world to us. We look forward to bringing you more content that inspires growth, joy, and purpose. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.